Hello, I'm Valerie Reid, and today I'm going to be sharing a couple of chapters from Roald Dahl's autobiography called Boy Tales of Childhood. And just a wee bit of background, Roald Dahl's parents were Norwegian, but they lived in Wales when he was a child. And his father died when he was 3 years old, and his mother's fervent wish was to move to England because his father had stated that the best schools in the world were English schools. And she managed to do that with her 6 children that she was left with when Roald was about 10. Now, these tales take place in Wales, and they are the year 1923 to 1926. So the little boy is 7 to 9. The bicycle and the sweet shop. When I was 7, my mother decided I should leave kindergarten and go to a proper boys' school. By good fortune, there existed a well-known preparatory school for boys about a mile from our house. It was called Llandaff Cathedral School. I can remember very little about the 2 years I attended Llandaff Cathedral School between the age of 7 and 9. Only 2 moments remain clearly in my mind. The first lasted not more than 5 seconds, but I will never forget it. It was my first term, and I was walking home alone across the village green after school, when suddenly one of the senior 12-year-old boys came riding full speed down the road on his bicycle about 20 yards away from me. The road was on a hill, and the boy was going down the slope, and as he flashed by, he started backpedaling very quickly, so that the freewheeling mechanism of his bike made a loud whirring sound. At the same time, he took his hands off the handlebars and folded them casually across his chest. I stopped dead and stared after him. How wonderful he was! How swift and brave and graceful in his long trousers with bicycle clips around them and his scarlet school cap at a jaunty angle on his head. One day, I told myself, one glorious day, I will have a bike like that, and I will wear long trousers with bicycle clips, and my school cap will sit jaunty on my head, and I will go whizzing down the hill, pedaling backwards with no hands on the handlebars. My second and only other memory of Llandaff Cathedral School is extremely bizarre. It happened a little over a year later when I was just 9. By then, I had made some friends, and when I walked to school in the mornings, I would start out alone but would pick up 4 other boys of my own age along the way. After school was over, the same 4 boys and I would set out together across the village green and through the village itself, heading for home. On the way to school and on the way back, we always passed the sweet shop. No, we didn't. We never passed it. We always stopped. We lingered outside its rather small window, gazing in at the big glass jars full of bullseyes and old-fashioned humbugs and strawberry bonbons and glacier mints and acid drops and pear drops and lemon drops and all the rest of them. Each of us received 6 pence a week for pocket money, and whenever there was any money in our pockets, we would all troop in together to buy a penny worth of this or that. My own favorites were sherbet suckers and licorice bootlaces. One of the other boys, whose name was Thwaites, told me I should never eat licorice bootlaces. Thwaites' father, who was a doctor, had said that they were made from rat's blood. The father had given his young son a lecture about licorice bootlaces when he had caught him eating one in bed. "Every rat catcher in the country," the father had said, "takes his rats to the licorice bootlace factory, and the manager pays 2 pence for each rat. Many a rat catcher has become a millionaire by selling his dead rats to the factory." But how do they turn the rats into licorice?" the young Thwaites had asked his father. "They wait until they've got 10,000 rats, the father had answered. Then they dump them all into a huge shiny steel cauldron and boil them up for several hours. 2 men stir the bubbling cauldrons with long poles, and in the end, they have a thick, steaming rat stew. After that, a cruncher is lowered into the cauldron to crunch the bones, and what's left is a pulpy substance called rat mash. Yes, but how do they turn that into licorice bootlaces, Daddy? The young Thwaites had asked. And this question, according to Thwaites, had caused his father to pause and think for a few moments before he answered it. At last he said, "The two men who were doing the stirring with the long poles now put on their Wellington boots and climb into the cauldron and shovel the hot rat mash out onto the concrete floor. And then they run a steamroller over it several times to flatten it out. What is left looks rather like a gigantic black pancake. And all they have to do after that is to wait for it to cool and to harden so they can cut it up into strips to make the bootlaces. Don't ever eat them," the father had said. "If you do, you get ratitis." "What is ratitis, Daddy?" young Thwaites had asked. "All the rats that the rat catchers catch are poisoned with rat poison," the father had said. "It's the rat poison that gives you ratitis." "Yes, but what happens to you when you catch it?" young Thwaites had asked. "Your teeth become very sharp and pointed," the father had answered, "and a short stumpy tail grows out of your back, just above your bottom. There is no cure for ratitis. I ought to know, I'm a doctor." We all enjoyed Thwaites' story, and we made him tell it to us many times on our walks to and from school. But it didn't stop any of us except Thwaites from buying licorice bootlaces. At 2 for a penny, they were the best value in the shop. A bootlace, in case you haven't had the pleasure of handling one, is not round. It's like a flat black tape about half an inch wide. You buy it rolled up in a coil, and in those days it used to be so long that when you unrolled it and held one end at arm's length above your head, the other end touched the ground. Pear drops were exciting because they had a dangerous taste. They smelled of nail varnish and they froze the back of your throat. All of us were warned against eating them, and the result was that we ate them more than ever. Then there was a hard brown lozenge called the tonsil tickler. The tonsil tickler tasted and smelled very strongly of chloroform. We had not the slightest doubt that these things were saturated in the dreaded anesthetic, which, as Thwaites had many times pointed out to us, could put you to sleep for hours at a stretch. "If my father has to saw off somebody's leg," he said, "he pours chloroform onto a pad and the person sniffs it and goes to sleep, and my father saws his leg off without him ever even feeling it." "But why do they put it into sweets and sell them to us?" we asked him. You might think a question like this would have baffled Thwaites, but Thwaites was never baffled. "My father says that tonsil ticklers were invented for dangerous prisoners in jail," he said. "They give them one with each meal, and the chloroform makes them sleepy and stops them rioting." "Yes," we said, "but why sell them to children?" "It's a plot," Thwaites said. "A grown-up plot to keep us quiet." The sweet shop in Llandaff in the year 1923 was the very center of our lives. To us, it was what a bar is to a drunk or a church to a bishop. Without it, there would have been little to live for. But it had one terrible drawback, this sweet shop. The woman who owned it was a horror. We hated her, and we had good reason for doing so. Her name was Mrs. Pratchett. She was a small, skinny old hag with a mustache on her upper lip and a mouth as sour as a green gooseberry. She never smiled. She never welcomed us when we went in, and the only time she spoke was when she said things like, "I'm watching you, so keep your thieving fingers off them chocolates." Or, "I don't want you in here just to look around. Either you forks out or you gets out." But by far the most loathsome thing about Mrs. Pratchett was the filth that clung to her. Her apron was gray and greasy. Her blouse had bits of breakfast all over it, toast crumbs and tea stains and splotches of dried egg yolk. It was her hands, however, that disturbed us most. They were disgusting. They were black with dirt and grime. They looked as though they had been putting lumps of coal on the fire all day long. And do not forget, please, that it was these very hands and fingers that she plunged into the sweet jars when we asked for a penny's worth of treacle toffee or nut clusters or whatever. There were precious few health laws in those days, and nobody, least of all Mrs. Pratchett, ever thought of using a little shovel for getting out the sweets as they do today. The mere sight of her grimy right hand with its black fingernails digging an ounce of chocolate fudge out of a jar would have caused a starving tramp to go running from the shop. But not us. Sweets were our lifeblood. We would have put up with far worse than that to get them. So we simply stood and watched in sullen silence while this disgusting old woman stirred around inside the jars with her foul fingers. The other thing we hated about Mrs. Pratchett was her meanness. Unless you spent a whole sixpence all in one go, she wouldn't give you a bag. Instead, you got your sweets twisted up in a small piece of newspaper, which she tore off a pile of old Daily Mirrors lying on the counter. So you can well understand that we had it in for Mrs. Pratchett in a big way. But we didn't know quite what to do about it. Many schemes were put forward, but none of them was any good. None of them, that is, until suddenly, one memorable afternoon, we found the dead mouse. My 4 friends and I had come across a loose floorboard at the back of the classroom, and when we pried it up with the blade of a pocket knife, we discovered a big hollow space underneath. This, we decided, would be our secret hiding place for sweets and other small treasures, such as conkers and monkey nuts and birds' eggs. Every afternoon, when the last lesson was over, the 5 of us would wait until the classroom had emptied. Then we would lift up the floorboard and examine our secret hoard, perhaps adding to it or taking something away. One day, when we lifted it up, we found a dead mouse lying among our treasures. It was an exciting discovery. Thwaites took it out by its tail and waved it in front of our faces. "What shall we do with it?" he cried. "It stinks," someone shouted. "Throw it out the window, quick." "Hold on a tick," I said. "Don't throw it away." Thwaites hesitated. They all looked at me. When writing about oneself, one must strive to be truthful. Truth is more important than modesty. I must tell you, therefore, that it was I and I alone who had the idea for the great and daring mouse plot. We all have our moments of brilliance and glory, and this was mine. "Why don't we," I said, "slip it into one of Mrs. Pratchett's jars of sweets? Then, when she puts her dirty hand in to grab a handful, she'll grab a stinky dead mouse instead." The other 4 stared at me in wonder. Then, as the sheer genius of the plot began to sink in, they all started grinning. They slapped me on the back. They cheered me and danced around the classroom. "We'll do it today," they cried. "We'll do it on the way home. You had the idea," they said to me, "so you can be the one to put it in the mouse in the jar." Thwaites handed me the mouse. I put it in my trouser pocket. Then the 5 of us left the school, crossed the village green, and headed for the sweet shop. We were tremendously jazzed up. We felt like a gang of desperados setting out to rob a train or blow up the sheriff's office. "Make sure you put it into a jar which is used often," someone said. "I'm putting it in Gobstoppers," I said. "The Gobstopper jar is never behind the counter." "I've got a penny," Thwaites said, "so I'll ask for 1 sherbet sucker and 1 bootlace. And while she turns away to get them, you slip the mouse in quickly with the Gobstoppers." Thus everything was arranged. We were strutting a little as we entered the shop. We were the victors now, and Mrs. Pratchett was the victim. She stood behind the counter, and her small, malignant pig eyes watched us suspiciously as we came forward. "1 sherbet sucker, please," Thwaites said to her, holding out his penny. I kept to the rear of the group, and when I saw Mrs. Pratchett turn her head away for a couple of seconds to fish a sherbet sucker out of the box, I lifted the heavy glass lid of the Gobstopper jar and dropped the mouse in. Then I replaced the lid as silently as possible. My heart was thumping like mad, and my hands had gone all sweaty. "And 1 bootlace, please," I heard Thwaites saying. When I turned around, I saw Mrs. Pratchett holding out the bootlace in her filthy fingers. "I don't want all the lot of you trooping in here if only one of you is buying," she screamed at us. "Now beat it! Get on! Go! Get!" As soon as we were outside, we broke into a run. "Did you do it?" they shouted at me. "Of course I did it," I said. "Well done, you!" they cried. "What a super show!" I felt like a hero. I was a hero. It was marvelous to be so popular. The flush of triumph over the dead mouse was carried forward to the next morning as we all met again to walk to school. "Let's go in and see if it's still in the jar," somebody said as we approached the sweet shop. "Don't," Thwaites said firmly. "It's too dangerous. Walk past as though nothing has happened." As we came level with the shop, we saw a cardboard notice hanging on the door. "Closed." We stopped and stared. We had never known the sweet shop to be closed at this time in the morning, even on Sundays. "What's happened?" we asked each other. "What's going on?" We pressed our faces against the window and looked inside. Mrs. Pratchett was nowhere to be seen. "Look," I cried. The gobstopper jar's gone. It's not on the shelf. There's a gap where it used to be. "It's on the floor," someone said. "It's smashed to bits and there's gobstoppers everywhere." "There's the mouse," someone else shouted. We could see it all, the huge glass jar, smashed to smithereens with a dead mouse lying in the wreckage and hundreds of many-colored gobstoppers littering the floor. "She got such a shock when she grabbed hold of the mouse that she dropped everything," somebody was saying. "But why didn't she sweep it all up and open the shop?" I asked. Nobody answered me. We turned away and walked towards school. All of a sudden, we had begun to feel slightly uncomfortable. There was something not quite right about the shop being closed. Even Thwaites was unable to offer a reasonable explanation. We became silent. There was a faint scent of danger in the air now. Each one of us had caught a whiff of it. Alarm bells were beginning to ring faintly in our ears. After a while, Thwaites broke the silence. "She must have got one heck of a shock," he said. He paused. We all looked at him, wondering what wisdom the great medical authority was going to come out with next. "After all," he went on, "to catch hold of a dead mouse when you're expecting to catch hold of a gobstopper must be a pretty frightening experience, don't you agree?" Nobody answered him. "Well now," Thwaites went on, "when an old person like Mrs. Pratchett suddenly gets a very big shock, I suppose you know what happens next?" "What?" we said. "What happens?" "You ask my father," Thwaites said. "He'll tell you." "You tell us," we said. "It gives her a heart attack," Thwaites announced. "Her heart stops beating and she's dead in 5 seconds. For a moment or two, my own heart stopped beating. Thwaites pointed a finger at me and said darkly, "I'm afraid you've killed her." "Me!" I cried. "Why just me?" "It was your idea," he said, "and what's more, you put the mouse in." All of a sudden, I was a murderer. At exactly that point, we heard the school bell ringing in the distance, and we had to gallop the rest of the way so as not to be late for prayers. The headmaster is the only teacher at Llandaff Cathedral School that I can remember, and for a reason you will soon discover, I can remember him very clearly indeed. His name was Mr. Coombs, and I have a picture in my mind of a giant of a man with a face like a ham and a mass of rusty-colored hair that sprouted in a tangle all over the top of his head. All grown-ups appear as giants to small children, but headmasters and policemen are the biggest giants of all and acquire a marvelously exaggerated stature. It is possible that Mr. Coombs was a perfectly normal being, but in my memory he was a giant, a tweed-suited giant who always wore a black gown over his tweeds and a waistcoat under his jacket. Mr. Coombs now proceeded to mumble through the same old prayers we had every day, but this morning when the last amen had been spoken, he did not turn and lead his group rapidly out of the hall as usual. He remained standing before us, and it was clear he had an announcement to make. "The whole school is to go out and line up around the playground immediately," he said. "Leave your books behind and no talking." Mr. Coombs was looking grim. His hammy pink face had taken on that dangerous scowl which only appeared when he was extremely cross and somebody was for the high jump. I sat there small and frightened among the rows and rows of other boys, and to me at that moment the headmaster with his black gown draped over his shoulder was like a judge at a murder trial. "He's after the killer," Thwaites whispered to me. I began to shiver. "I'll bet the police are here already," Thwaites went on, "and the Black Mariah's waiting outside." As we made our way out to the playground, my whole stomach began to feel as though it was slowly filling up with swirling water. "I am only 8 years old," I told myself. "No little boy of 8 has ever murdered anybody. It's not possible." Out on the playground on this warm, cloudy September day, the deputy headmaster was shouting, "Line up and form! Spread out! Get on with it!" Thwaites and I and my other 3 friends were in the second form, the lowest but one, and we lined up against the red brick wall of the playground shoulder to shoulder, about 100 small boys altogether, aged between 6 and 12. "Stop that talking!" shouted the deputy head. "I want absolute silence!" But why, for heaven's sake, were we in the playground at all, I wondered, and why were we lined up like this? It had never happened before. I half expected to see 2 policemen come bounding out of the school to grab me by the arms and put handcuffs on my wrists. A single door led out from the school onto the playground. Suddenly, It swung open, and through it, like the angel of death, strode Mr. Coombs, huge and bulky in his tweed suit and black gown, and beside him, believe it or not, right beside him, trotted the tiny figure of Mrs. Pratchett herself. Mrs. Pratchett was alive! The relief was tremendous. "She's alive!" I whispered to Thwaites, standing next to me. "I didn't kill her!" Thwaites ignored me. "We'll start over here," Mr. Coombs was saying to Mrs. Pratchett. He grasped her by one of her skinny arms and led her to where the sixth form was standing. Then, still keeping hold of her arm, he proceeded to lead her at a brisk walk down the line of boys. It was like someone inspecting the troops. "What on earth are they doing?" I whispered. Thwaites didn't answer me. I glanced at him. He had gone rather pale. "Too big," I heard Mrs. Pratchett saying. "Much too big. It's none of this lot. Let's have a look at some of them titchy ones." Mr. Coombs increased his pace. "We better go all the way around," he said. He seemed in a hurry to get it over with now, and I could see Mrs. Pratchett's skinny goat legs trotting to keep up with him. They had already inspected one side of the playground. "Still too big," I heard Mrs. Pratchett croaking. "Much too big. Smaller than these. Much smaller. Where's them nasty little ones?" They were coming closer to us now, closer and closer. They were starting on the fourth side. Every boy in our form was watching Mr. Coombs, and Mrs. Pratchett as they came walking down the line towards us. "Nasty, cheeky lot, those little uns," I heard Mrs. Pratchett muttering. "They comes into my shop and they thinks they can do what they damn well likes." Mr. Coombs made no reply to this. "They nick things when I ain't looking," she went on. "They put their grubby hands all over everything, and they've got no manners. I don't mind girls. I never have no trouble with girls, but boys is idiots and horrible. I don't have to tell you that, Headmaster, do I?" "These are the smaller ones," Mr. Coombs said. I could see Mrs. Pratchett's piggy little eyes staring hard at the face of each boy she passed. Suddenly, she let out a high-pitched yell and pointed a dirty finger straight at Thwaites. "That's him!" she yelled. "That's one of them! I'd know him a mile away, that scummy little bounder." The entire school turned to look at Thwaites. "What have I done?" he stuttered, appealing to Mr. Coombs. "Shut up," Mr. Coombs said. Mrs. Pratchett's eyes flicked over and settled on my own face. I looked down and studied the black asphalt surface of the playground. "Here's another of them!" I heard her yelling. "That one there!" She was pointing at me now. "You're quite sure?" Mr. Coombs said. "Of course I'm sure," she cried. "I never forgets a face, least of all when it's as sly as that. He's one of 'em all right. There were 5 of 'em. Now where's them other 3? The other 3, as I knew very well, were coming up next. Mrs. Pratchett's face was glimmering with venom as her eyes traveled beyond me down the line. "There they are!" she cried out, stabbing the air with her finger. "M and M and M! That's the 5 of them, all right. We don't need to look no further than this, Headmaster. They're all here, the nasty, dirty little pigs. You got their names, have you?" "I've got their names, Mrs. Pratchett," Mr. Coombs told her. "I'm much obliged to you." "And I'm much obliged to you, Headmaster," she answered. As Mr. Coombs led her away across the playground, we heard her saying, "Right in the jar of gobstoppers it was, a stinking dead mouse, which I will never forget as long as I live." "You have my deepest sympathy," Mr. Coombs was muttering. "Talk about shocks," she went on. "When my fingers caught hold of that nasty, soggy, stinking dead mouse—" Her voice trailed away as Mr. Coombs led her quickly through the door and into the school building. What ended up happening was the boys received a very severe caning. And when Roald Dahl's mother discovered this, when he took his bath that night, she marched right over to the school and informed Mr. Coombs that this would never happen again. And shortly thereafter, she succeeded in removing him from Lambeth School and moving to England.